Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet one final time as she climbed into the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram airfield in Afghanistan, and the familiar weight of her flight gear felt heavier than usual. Today's mission was different from the routine patrols she had flown over the past 6 months. Intelligence reports indicated a large group of Taliban fighters had surrounded a small forward operating base in the mountains, and coalition forces were in desperate need of close air support. The briefing had been tense. Major Rodriguez had outlined the situation with military precision, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. The enemy forces were well positioned in rocky terrain that made traditional ground assaults nearly impossible. The trapped soldiers had been under siege for 18 hours, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with thick cloud cover moving in from the west that would make flying treacherous by afternoon. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency, her fingers dancing over the controls she knew by heart. The A-10's twin engines hummed to life, their distinctive sound echoing across the airfield. She had logged over 800 hours in the Warthog, as pilots affectionately called the aircraft, and trusted its rugged design completely. The plane was built for one purpose: providing devastating close air support to ground forces in the most dangerous situations. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah's radio crackled to life. Flight Leader Lieutenant Colonel Barnes would be leading today's mission with 3 other A-10s in formation. Each pilot had been carefully selected for this operation based on their experience and precision in close-quarters combat. The enemy positions were dangerously close to friendly forces, requiring surgical strikes that only the most skilled pilots could execute safely. The takeoff was smooth, despite the gusty crosswinds that had begun picking up as the storm system approached. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as her aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed into the morning sky. Below, the brown landscape of Afghanistan stretched endlessly, marked by jagged mountain ranges and deep valleys where danger lurked behind every ridge. She knew that somewhere in those mountains, American soldiers were counting on her and her fellow pilots to help them survive until reinforcements could arrive. Radio communications confirmed that all 4 aircraft were airborne and forming up according to plan. The flight would take 45 minutes to reach the target area, giving Sarah time to review the tactical situation one more time. The enemy had chosen their position well, using natural cave formations and rocky outcroppings to shield themselves from aerial observation. Finding and engaging these targets would require patience, skill, and perhaps most importantly, fuel management that would allow for multiple attack runs. Sarah checked her fuel gauges and noted the readings in her flight log. She had enough JP-8 fuel for approximately 2 hours of flight time, including combat maneuvering and the return journey to base. The weather forecast worried her more than the tactical situation. If the approaching storm system moved faster than predicted, visibility could drop to near zero within hours, making the return flight extremely hazardous even for experienced pilots. The radio chattered with updates from forward air controllers on the ground who were painting targets with laser designators. These brave soldiers were positioned dangerously close to enemy lines, risking their lives to provide accurate targeting information for the incoming air support. Sarah listened carefully to their calm, professional voices, knowing that behind that composure were men who had been under constant fire for almost a full day. As the flight approached the target area, Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations in the valley below. The enemy had been using mortars and rocket-propelled grenades to keep the coalition forces pinned down in their defensive positions. Time was running out for the soldiers on the ground, and Sarah knew that her aircraft and those of her fellow pilots represented their best hope for survival until ground reinforcements could fight their way through the mountain passes. The mission was about to begin in earnest, and Sarah felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that came with combat flying. She had trained for situations exactly like this one, but no amount of simulation could fully prepare a pilot for the reality of life and death decisions made at 300 miles per hour while under enemy fire. The next few hours would test every skill she had learned and every instinct she had developed during her military career. The valley came into view as Sarah's flight descended through 15,000 feet, and immediately she could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies from the mountainside. The Taliban positions were exactly where intelligence had predicted, dug into natural cave systems that provided excellent protection from air attack. Sarah switched her radio to the ground controller frequency and heard the distinctive voice of Sergeant Martinez, the forward air controller who had been directing defensive fire for the past 18 hours. His situation report was grim, but delivered with professional calm. The enemy had approximately 60 fighters positioned in a horseshoe formation around the small outpost, with heavy machine guns and mortars providing continuous suppressive fire. Coalition casualties were mounting, and medical supplies were critically low. The isolated soldiers needed immediate relief, and they needed it before the approaching weather system made air support impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes began coordinating the attack runs, assigning each pilot specific target areas to ensure maximum coverage without friendly fire incidents. Sarah was assigned the northeastern section of the enemy line, where intelligence indicated the heaviest concentration of automatic weapons. She began her first attack run at 12,000 feet, diving toward the rocky terrain while scanning for targets through her targeting pod. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon was a fearsome weapon, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of 30mm depleted uranium shells that could penetrate tank armor. But today's mission required precision rather than overwhelming firepower. The enemy positions were close enough to friendly forces that a mistake could result in devastating friendly fire casualties. Sarah had to identify each target individually and ensure clear fields of fire before engaging. Her first target appeared in the crosshairs, a machine gun nest positioned behind a natural rock barrier that had been harassing the western perimeter of the outpost. Sarah waited until her aircraft was at the optimal firing angle, then squeezed the trigger for a controlled 2-second burst. The cannon's distinctive sound filled her cockpit as dozens of shells streaked toward the target. Through her targeting system, she watched the rounds impact precisely on target, silencing the enemy position permanently. Ground controllers confirmed the hit and immediately called for strikes on adjacent positions. Sarah pulled up from her attack run and began climbing for altitude to set up her next pass. The enemy had responded to the air attack by increasing their rate of fire, apparently hoping to either drive off the aircraft or score a lucky hit that would bring down one of the A-10's. Tracer rounds zipped past Sarah's aircraft as she climbed, but the Warthog's armored cockpit and redundant systems were designed to absorb significant battle damage. The second attack run was more challenging because the enemy had begun using smoke grenades to obscure their positions. Sarah had to rely on coordinates provided by ground controllers who were observing enemy muzzle flashes through the artificial fog. She lined up on the designated target area and fired another controlled burst, trusting in the accuracy of the soldiers on the ground who were risking their lives to provide targeting information. After 30 minutes of continuous combat, Sarah checked her fuel gauges and felt the first twinge of concern. The constant maneuvering and combat flying was consuming fuel faster than planned, and she was already down to 60% of her original load. The other pilots in her flight were reporting similar consumption rates, which meant the formation would need to consider returning to base for refueling sooner than originally anticipated. But the situation on the ground remained critical. Sergeant Martinez reported that the airstrikes had significantly reduced enemy fire, but substantial hostile forces remained in positions that continued to threaten the outpost. The trapped soldiers had managed to evacuate their most seriously wounded to a more secure location, but they still faced overwhelming odds if the air support departed before ground reinforcements arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes made the difficult decision to continue the mission despite fuel concerns. Intelligence reports indicated that a relief column was fighting its way through mountain passes and should reach the area within 2 hours. If the A-10's could maintain pressure on enemy positions for that length of time, the surrounded soldiers would survive. If they departed too early, the Taliban forces would likely overrun the outpost before help arrived. Sarah acknowledged the order and began setting up for another attack run, but she couldn't ignore the fuel situation completely. Combat flying required careful energy management, and pilots who ignored their fuel state often found themselves in situations where heroic intentions led to tragic outcomes. She would need to balance aggressive support for the ground forces with prudent flight planning that ensured her safe return to base. The battle was far from over, and Sarah knew that the most challenging decision still lay ahead. Each attack run brought her closer to minimum fuel levels, But each successful strike improved the chances of survival for the soldiers counting on her support. The storm system that meteorologists had predicted for late afternoon began arriving 2 hours ahead of schedule, bringing with it thick gray clouds that reduced visibility to less than 5 miles. Sarah watched the wall of weather approaching from the west while she completed her 5th attack run of the day, and she knew that flying conditions were about to become significantly more dangerous for everyone involved in the mission. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes called for a formation check, and the news was not encouraging. All 4 A-10’s were reporting fuel levels below 50%, and the approaching weather would make the return flight to Bagram much more challenging than originally planned. The mountains of Afghanistan were notorious for creating sudden and severe weather conditions that could trap aircraft in dangerous situations with little warning. Despite the deteriorating conditions, the tactical situation on the ground showed significant improvement. The sustained air attacks had broken up several enemy assault attempts, and Sergeant Martinez reported that hostile fire had decreased substantially. However, intelligence intercepts indicated that Taliban commanders were bringing in reinforcements from surrounding areas, apparently planning a major assault once the weather forced the air support to depart. Sarah felt the first turbulence from the approaching storm as she climbed back to altitude after engaging a mortar position that had been causing casualties among the defenders. The A-10 handled rough air well due to its sturdy construction, but the buffeting made precise targeting more difficult and increased fuel consumption as she fought to maintain stable flight. Each gust of wind was a reminder that time was running out for both the air mission and the soldiers on the ground. The radio crackled with an update from base operations that made the situation even more complex. The relief column that had been fighting its way through the mountain passes had encountered stronger resistance than expected, and was still at least 90 minutes away from the besieged outpost. This meant that the A-10 flight would need to maintain air support for much longer than originally planned, stretching their fuel reserves to dangerous levels. Sarah checked her gauges again and calculated that she had perhaps 45 minutes of flying time remaining before reaching minimum fuel for the return journey. In normal weather conditions, that would be adequate to provide continued support and still make it safely back to base. But the approaching storm meant that the return flight could take much longer than usual, especially if visibility dropped enough to require instrument approaches at Bagram. The weather was affecting the enemy forces as well, but not necessarily in favor of the coalition troops. The reduced visibility from the clouds and increasing wind was making it harder for the A-10 pilots to spot targets, while the Taliban fighters could use the same conditions to move closer to the perimeter without being observed from the air. Several times Sarah heard urgent calls from ground controllers about enemy movement that the aircraft were unable to locate through the deteriorating visibility. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes faced an impossible decision as mission commander. Military doctrine clearly stated that aircraft should not be pushed beyond safe fuel margins, especially in deteriorating weather conditions. But abandoning the mission too early would almost certainly result in the outpost being overrun, with casualties that could be prevented by continued air support. The lives of the pilots had to be balanced against the lives of the soldiers they were protecting. Sarah understood the complexity of the situation without needing it explained over the radio. She had trained for scenarios exactly like this one, where tactical success required accepting calculated risks that pushed beyond normal safety margins. The key was making sure that those risks were truly calculated rather than reckless, and that meant honestly assessing her aircraft's capabilities and her own skills as a pilot. The wind began picking up noticeably, creating more turbulence that made flying at low altitude increasingly difficult. Sarah had to adjust her attack runs to account for the gusting conditions, which meant using more fuel for each engagement and taking longer to line up precise shots. The mathematical equation of fuel versus time was becoming increasingly unfavorable, but the radio calls from the ground indicated that her strikes were still having significant impact on enemy capabilities. As she completed another attack run and pulled up into the gray clouds that were now covering most of the valley, Sarah made a personal decision about how she would handle the remainder of the mission. She would continue to provide support as long as she could do so safely, but she would also monitor her fuel state carefully and make sure she retained enough reserves to get home, regardless of weather conditions. The soldiers on the ground needed her help, but they would not be served by having her aircraft crash in the mountains due to fuel starvation. Sarah's fuel gauges showed readings that would have been alarming under normal circumstances, but were becoming genuinely dangerous given the deteriorating weather conditions. She had reached what pilots called a critical fuel state, where every decision about remaining on station had to be weighed against the mathematical certainty of fuel exhaustion. The A-10's twin engines were reliable and fuel efficient, but they could not run on determination alone. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes called for another formation check, and the responses revealed that all 4 aircraft were facing similar fuel constraints. The mission commander's voice carried the weight of command responsibility as he acknowledged each pilot's report and calculated the time remaining before the entire flight would need to depart regardless of the ground situation. Military aviation was built on precise planning and conservative fuel management, but combat often demanded decisions that pushed beyond peacetime safety margins. The situation on the ground had stabilized somewhat due to the sustained air attacks, but Sergeant Martinez reported that enemy forces were repositioning for what appeared to be a coordinated assault. Intelligence intercepts suggested that Taliban commanders were waiting for the aircraft to depart before launching their main attack, confident that the weather would prevent the A-10's from returning once they left the area. The timing of their assault plan showed sophisticated understanding of aviation limitations and weather patterns. Sarah executed what she knew might be her final attack run of the mission, targeting a group of enemy fighters who had been spotted moving through a narrow ravine toward the outpost's eastern perimeter. The shot required precise timing because the targets were moving, and the gusting wind made maintaining a stable firing platform increasingly difficult. She waited until the optimal moment, then fired a controlled burst that scattered the enemy formation and forced them to seek cover. As she climbed away from the target area, Sarah performed calculations that every military pilot learns during training, but hopes never to use in actual combat. She estimated her current fuel flow rate, factored in the additional consumption required for flying in turbulent conditions, and calculated the minimum fuel required for the return journey to Bagram. The numbers were not encouraging, especially considering that the weather would likely force instrument approaches that consumed additional fuel. The relief column radioed an update that provided both hope and additional pressure. They had broken through the enemy resistance in the mountain passes and were now only 45 minutes away from the besieged outpost. This meant that if the A-10's could maintain their presence for less than an hour longer, the ground reinforcements would arrive in time to break the siege. But that hour represented nearly all of Sarah's remaining fuel reserves. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes made the decision that Sarah had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. 2 of the A-10's would depart immediately to ensure their safe return to base, while the remaining 2 aircraft would continue providing support until their fuel states became absolutely critical. Sarah volunteered to remain, along with Captain Rodriguez, who had been flying combat missions in Afghanistan for over a year and understood the stakes involved. The departure of 2 aircraft changed the tactical dynamics significantly. Sarah and Captain Rodriguez would need to cover the same area that had previously required 4 aircraft, which meant longer intervals between attack runs and more opportunity for enemy forces to regroup and reposition. The psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces would be substantial, as everyone on the ground would realize that air support was diminishing just as the weather made replacement aircraft unlikely. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she acknowledged the mission commander's orders and watched 2 of her fellow pilots disappear into the gray clouds heading east toward base. She was now one of only 2 pilots standing between the trapped soldiers and a potentially overwhelming enemy assault. The fuel gauges that had been merely concerning an hour earlier were now the primary factor determining how long she could continue the mission. The radio crackled with reports from ground. Observers who had spotted large groups of enemy fighters moving into assault positions, under cover of the deteriorating weather. The Taliban commanders had apparently decided that the reduced air cover represented their best opportunity to overrun the outpost before reinforcements arrived. Sarah could hear the tension in Sergeant Martinez's voice as he called for immediate strikes on multiple targets simultaneously. Captain Rodriguez coordinated with Sarah to ensure they could cover the most critical threats despite having only 2 aircraft remaining. They would alternate attack runs to maintain continuous pressure on enemy positions, but the reduced numbers meant that some targets would have to be left unengaged while they focused on the most immediate threats to the ground forces. Every decision carried life and death consequences for the soldiers counting on their support. The moment that Sarah had been dreading finally arrived when Captain Rodriguez announced over the radio that he had reached minimum fuel and needed to depart immediately for base. His voice carried the frustration of a professional warrior who understood that leaving meant abandoning soldiers who still needed help, but who also knew that staying would likely result in his aircraft crashing in the mountains. Sarah acknowledged his departure with professional calm while privately calculating that she was now the only air support remaining for the besieged outpost. Her own fuel gauges showed readings that would normally have triggered an immediate return to base under any circumstances. She had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time remaining before reaching the absolute minimum required for the journey home, and that calculation assumed perfect weather conditions that clearly no longer existed. The storm system had brought with it not only reduced visibility but also strong headwinds that would increase fuel consumption during the return flight. Sergeant Martinez's voice on the radio carried a new urgency as he reported massive enemy movement toward all sides of the outpost perimeter. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 200 Taliban fighters were now in position for a coordinated assault that would begin as soon as the last aircraft departed. The relief column was still 30 minutes away, which meant that Sarah's presence for just a few more minutes could make the difference between successful defense and catastrophic defeat. Sarah found herself facing the kind of decision that military training prepares pilots for, but that no amount of classroom instruction can truly simulate. She could depart immediately and ensure her own survival, while probably condemning the soldiers on the ground to defeat, or she could remain on station past safe fuel limits and risk not only her own life, but the loss of a valuable aircraft that could save other lives in future missions. The mathematical calculations were brutally simple. If she remained for another 15 minutes, she would be cutting her fuel reserve so thin that even minor problems during the return flight could result in fuel exhaustion over the mountains. If mechanical issues forced her to take a longer route, if the weather worsened beyond current predictions, or if air traffic control delays kept her aircraft in holding patterns, she might not make it back to base alive. But the human calculations were equally compelling. The soldiers she could see through her targeting pod were young men and women who had volunteered to serve their country, and who were now trapped in an impossible situation through no fault of their own. They had families waiting for them at home, dreams and ambitions that would never be fulfilled if they died in a remote Afghan valley, because air support departed 15 minutes too early. Sarah made her decision with the clear-headed analysis that had made her one of the most respected pilots in her squadron. She would remain on station until the relief column was within 10 minutes of the outpost, providing continuous air support to prevent the enemy assault that would otherwise overwhelm the defenders. She would monitor her fuel state carefully and depart at the last possible moment that still allowed for safe return to base. The enemy assault began just as she was completing another attack run, with coordinated attacks from 3 different directions, designed to overwhelm the outnumbered defenders. Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from dozens of positions as Taliban fighters emerged from concealment and began their advance toward the outpost perimeter. The volume of fire was unlike anything she had observed during the earlier phases of the battle. Ground controllers were calling for immediate air support on multiple targets simultaneously. But Sarah was only one pilot with one aircraft. She had to prioritize the most critical threats while accepting that some enemy positions would remain unengaged. Her targeting decisions in the next few minutes would directly determine which of the soldiers below lived or died, a responsibility that no training could fully prepare someone to handle. Sarah selected her targets based on tactical priority, focusing on heavy weapons positions that posed the greatest threat to the defensive perimeter. Each attack run required precious fuel and time, but each successful strike disrupted enemy coordination and bought additional minutes for the relief column to close the distance. She could hear the professional calm in Sergeant Martinez's voice beginning to crack as he coordinated defensive fire while calling for air support on targets that were advancing closer to his position. The relief column radioed that they were now only 15 minutes away, but Sarah's fuel gauges indicated that she had perhaps 10 minutes remaining before reaching the absolute minimum required for return flight. The mathematical precision of fuel consumption was colliding with the chaotic reality of combat, and Sarah knew that her next decision would be the most important of her military career. Sarah crossed the line that separated calculated risk from potentially fatal decision-making when she chose to remain on station, despite her fuel gauges showing readings below minimum safe levels. Every additional minute she stayed increased the probability that she would not make it back to base alive. But the desperate calls from ground controllers made it clear that departing now would likely result in the deaths of soldiers who had been fighting for their lives for over 24 hours. The Taliban assault was reaching its climax as enemy fighters advanced within 50 meters of the outpost perimeter on two sides. Sarah could see through her targeting pod that the defenders were being forced back into increasingly smaller defensive positions, and several of the machine gun nests that had been providing covering fire had fallen silent. Sergeant Martinez's voice over the radio carried the strain of a man who was calling for air support while simultaneously directing defensive fire with his own weapon. Sarah's attack runs were becoming increasingly precise as desperation focused her concentration to surgical levels. She knew that every round she fired had to count because she might not have fuel remaining for another pass. The enemy was so close to friendly positions that her margin for error had shrunk to mere meters, requiring the kind of precision that could only be achieved by a pilot operating at the absolute peak of their abilities. The relief column announced that they were only 8 minutes away, but Sarah's fuel gauges indicated that she was already flying on reserves that should have been kept for emergency situations. The A-10's engines were operating normally, but fuel starvation could occur suddenly and without warning once the tanks approached empty. If her engines quit over the mountains during the return flight, she would face the choice between ejecting into hostile territory or attempting a forced landing in terrain that was unforgiving to aircraft. Ground controllers reported that the enemy assault was beginning to falter under the sustained air attacks, but significant threats remained active on the northern perimeter, where Taliban fighters had established positions in a small group of buildings just outside the outpost. Sarah lined up for what she knew would likely be her final attack run, targeting the structures that were providing cover for enemy machine gun teams. As she dove toward the target, Sarah felt the strange clarity that sometimes comes to pilots in extreme situations. Time seemed to slow down as she acquired the target, adjusted for wind drift, and squeezed the trigger for a sustained burst that demolished the enemy position. The secondary explosion suggested that the buildings had been used to store ammunition, and the elimination of that threat significantly reduced pressure on the northern defensive line. Pulling up from the attack run, Sarah heard the most welcome sound of the entire mission, the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Hayes announcing that the relief column had visual contact with the outpost and would be in position to provide ground support within 3 minutes. The timing was so close that Sarah realized her decision to stay beyond safe fuel limits had quite literally made the difference between success and disaster for the mission. But now she faced the consequences of that decision during the most challenging flight of her career. Her fuel gauges showed readings that were well into the red zone, indicating that fuel exhaustion could occur at any moment. The weather had continued to deteriorate during the extended mission, with visibility dropping to less than 2 miles and turbulence that made flying at low altitude increasingly dangerous. Sarah turned her aircraft toward home and began climbing to altitude for the return journey, while running calculations in her head about fuel consumption rates and flight time requirements. The headwinds generated by the storm system would increase her flight time by approximately 15%, which meant that fuel that would normally be adequate for the return journey was now marginal at best. She would need to fly the most fuel-efficient profile possible while navigating through weather that demanded constant attention and course corrections. The radio crackled with updates from the ground as the relief column engaged the remaining enemy forces and began establishing a secure perimeter around the outpost. Sergeant Martinez reported that casualties had been lighter than expected, thanks to the sustained air support that had prevented the enemy assault from reaching its full potential. The soldiers she had protected were safe, but Sarah was now facing the possibility that her decision to save their lives might cost her own. As she flew east toward Bagram through increasingly turbulent air, Sarah monitored her fuel gauges with the kind of attention that only comes when survival depends on precise measurement. Every minute that passed brought her closer to either safety or the moment when her engines would quit and force her to make decisions that no pilot wants to contemplate. The flight back to Bagram became a test of both piloting skill and psychological endurance as Sarah nursed her fuel-starved aircraft through deteriorating weather conditions that seemed determined to prevent her safe return. Every few minutes she checked her gauges, calculating and recalculating the fuel remaining against the distance still to cover. The numbers were so close that minor variations in wind speed or engine efficiency could determine whether she made it home or became another casualty of the Afghan conflict. 20 miles from base, Sarah's low fuel warning light illuminated, confirming what her gauges had been indicating for the past 10 minutes. She was now flying on fumes with perhaps 5 to 7 minutes of fuel remaining under optimal conditions. The weather was far from optimal, with gusting crosswinds that required constant throttle adjustments and course corrections that consumed additional fuel with every movement of the control's Bagram approach control had been monitoring her progress and cleared her straight in for runways 03, eliminating the need for time-consuming traffic patterns that could exhaust her remaining fuel. The controller's voice carried professional calm, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension of someone who understood exactly how critical her fuel situation had become. Emergency vehicles were being positioned along the runway in case her engines quit during the final approach. As Sarah began her descent toward the airfield, she could see the runway lights cutting through the gray afternoon gloom like a beacon of salvation, but the approach was complicated by turbulence that shook her aircraft and made maintaining a stable glide path increasingly difficult. Each gust of wind that forced her to adjust power settings consumed fuel that she could not afford to lose, turning the final few minutes of flight into an agonizing test of fuel management. The mountain peaks on either side of the approach corridor disappeared into the low clouds, creating the psychological pressure of flying through a narrow tunnel with little room for error. Sarah's training took over as she focused entirely on the instruments and visual references that would guide her aircraft safely to the runway. She had practiced this approach hundreds of times, but never with fuel levels so low that engine failure was a constant possibility. At 3 miles from touchdown, Sarah's fuel gauges showed readings that were effectively at 0, meaning that fuel exhaustion could occur at any moment. The A-10's engines continued to run smoothly, drawing fuel from every available source within the aircraft's systems, but the laws of physics could not be negotiated or bargained with. When the fuel was gone, the engines would quit regardless of how much she needed them to continue running. The runway threshold passed beneath her aircraft as Sarah reduced power for landing, knowing that this might be the last time she would ever see those particular lights from the cockpit of an airplane. The landing was firm but controlled, and she immediately applied wheel brakes while her engines continued to operate on whatever fuel remained in the system. Only when her aircraft had rolled to a complete stop did Sarah allow herself to believe that she had actually made it back alive. Ground crews surrounded her aircraft as she shut down the engines, and the post-flight inspection revealed just how close she had come to disaster. The fuel tanks contained less than 50 gallons total, which represented approximately 2 minutes of flight time under the conditions she had experienced during the approach. If the weather had been slightly worse, if the approach had taken slightly longer, or if any number of small factors had been different, she would not have survived the return journey. The mission debrief revealed the full scope of what had been accomplished during those critical hours over the Afghan mountains. The sustained air support had prevented what intelligence analysts estimated would have been a complete massacre of the outpost defenders, saving the lives of 37 soldiers who would otherwise have been killed or captured. The relief column had arrived just as enemy forces were preparing for their final assault, and the Taliban fighters had withdrawn, rather than face combined air and ground attacks. Sarah's decision to remain on station beyond safe fuel limits had quite literally made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The soldiers she had protected would return home to their families because one pilot had been willing to risk everything to ensure they survived. Her actions that day would become part of Air Force legend, studied by future generations of pilots who would face similar decisions about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. As Sarah walked away from her aircraft that evening, she carried with her the knowledge that 37 families would be reunited because she had chosen to push beyond safe limits when the situation demanded extraordinary measures. The fuel gauges in her cockpit had shown empty, but her courage had proven that some reserves can never be measured by instruments alone.